All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, nearly every single day since the January 6th Capitol riots, we have seen an evolving elite scheme to infringe upon our civil liberties and crack down on American citizens. In a way, this is understandable. There literally was a storming of the Capitol. It was terrifying, and it was a terrible day in American history. But many of the most cynical people in our society are using this relatively isolated, crazy event to justify a grab bag wish list of center-left establishment concerns, which will do immense damage to our country and will only further split us apart. Some of this wish list involves the government, like we've seen with a $500 million deployment of troops to Washington, D.C., or the call for a new domestic terror law. But it's in the private sector where things are becoming especially dystopian. You saw the essential banishment of Parler from the internet, the removal of the president from Twitter, the mass purging of accounts all across social media. In some isolated incidents, maybe these were even justified, but they have birthed a new politics which is the most dangerous of all. A politics where political officials themselves are not forced to make big and monumental decisions by compromise and through the legislative process, but instead one where Republicans and Democrats either beg or castigate social media companies for essentially governing. That's where we find ourselves today, in one of the worst proposals yet, with Democratic members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee writing to Comcast, AT&T, Spectrum, Dish, Verizon, Cox, and Altice, asking about their own role in, quote, the spread of dangerous misinformation. The committee members also included Roku, Amazon, Apple, Google, and Hulu in their letter. So what do these members mean by limiting the spread of disinformation? They want these cable and internet media companies to stop distributing Fox News, OAN, and Newsmax. Let me repeat that again, because they themselves are against content put out by Fox, Newsmax, and OAN. They want the cable carriers and internet distribution companies to drop them. I am not the biggest fan of Fox, OAN, or Newsmax, but that does not matter. This is a threat to press freedom, censorship, and immense escalation. Let me explain using a useful analogy for my friends in tech. It's called the stack. Now, for those coders out there who watch the show, if I butcher this, I'm sorry. But basically, think of our current entertainment complex as a stack. At the most basic level, you have the user. Above that, you have the company. Above that, you have the infrastructure that supports that company. And above that, you have the government, which sets regulations which govern the infrastructure. With me? Censorship is essentially creeping up the stack. It began with inconsistent standards for deplatforming users. People on the right and the left lobbied companies like Twitter, Facebook, and others to take individual users or company accounts down. In some cases, again, this was justified, but the general unit of censorship was limited to specific platforms. But something has changed under the Trump era. The consolidation and the unit of censorship began to get bigger. It began with individual companies all making the same independent decision at the same time, like Facebook, Twitter, and Google all banning someone at the same time in response to a specific controversy. But things culminated up the level of the stack when Amazon Web Services decided not to host that company anymore. That was the first company-level deplatforming or censorship that we have witnessed, and it made the rails of media distribution themselves fair game in this process. That's where we find ourselves right now. Major lawmakers on a powerful committee in the House of Representatives are begging these private companies to take down Fox, OAN, and Newsmax. How should you feel about them? It should be immaterial to the question of whether you believe a handful of select distribution platforms should have a say in what they beam literally into your house. We already have a recourse for the problems that these people are complaining about. AT&T and Comcast or YouTube is not responsible for the content it is giving you. Fox News, OAN, and Newsmax are. And guess what? All of them are being sued by Dominion voting systems for a ton of money. In the case where discrete misinformation around election fraud could be proven, these companies have shielded themselves from legal liability by apologizing, or they may have to settle for immense sums of money in the future. That's called justice. Banning the entire distribution of a media company is completely insane, and it represents exactly the overreach which is typical of today's moment. As friend of the show Glenn Greenwald writes, quote, "Since when is it the role of the U.S. government to arbitrate and enforce precepts of journalistic integrity, unless you believe in the right of the government to regulate and control what the press says, a power which the First Amendment explicitly prohibits? How can anyone be comfortable with members of Congress arrogating themselves unto themselves the power to dictate what media outlets are permitted to report and control, how they discuss and analyze the news of the day?" The worst part about all of this is I expect censorship at the next level of the stack to become even more mainstream. This cockamamie idea to deplatform Fox News started on CNN just a few weeks ago, and now Democratic lawmakers are proposing it. The next step is going after protocols themselves, and the New York Times has already laid the groundwork, pointing to Telegram and Signal as potential hotbeds of misinformation. Why? Because encryption protocols themselves are by definition not able to be read or intercepted by the government or moderated by the New York Times yet. And in due time, this too will come under fire by lawmakers. And when it does, we will have only ourselves to blame for not resisting it. And Crystal, I know that this passed relatively without comment, but it actually is a big deal.
Yeah.
You have ranking members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee who are responsible for governing these companies and oversight of them, begging them essentially to deplatform Fox, OAN, and Newsmax. And again, think about where this leads. When the cable carriers become a unit of censorship, what's next? ISPs, internet service providers. We will soon come to a place, we are probably 5 years from this, in which Comcast and Time Warner, which control, I don't even know, Comcast, Verizon, and Time Warner, probably 90 or something % of the market, don't fact check or don't quote me on that, but they will collectively be able to decide, we are going to say Parler.com can no longer be accessed by our users because it represents misinformation. Think about what that means. ISP level bans. That should only be in place whenever an ISP is in direct violation of federal law. No company should ever be deciding that. But this is how it's working. First Parler, and now it's coming here to the media, the literal rails of media. Next will be the internet itself is up for debate. And I just think that we are going down the most dangerous road. You pointed out that Signal thing to me.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Encryption protocols themselves are like, we can't have encryption because of misinformation. Think about how insane that is.
I just jotted down while you were doing your radar, all of the things that have come in for this same sort of there's misinformation going on there, which is exactly as you described. It's laying the groundwork for taking exactly these sorts of actions. So Signal and Telegram, Substack.
Yes.
Podcasts, writ large.
Yes.
Podcasts.
A hotbed of misinformation.
Right. Clubhouse.
Right.
I mean, all of these things, just in the past, 2 months, have come under the same treatment of we can't have this going on, these unfettered conversations, as they described it on Clubhouse. And so when we cover something like Brian Stelter on CNN floating banning Fox News or banning certain programs on Fox News, those things don't exist in isolation.
Exactly.
That's all, laying the groundwork. It's all giving mainstream justification for exactly these kinds of actions. Now, let's say you don't even really care about the principle of free speech. It's not important to you. Mm-hmm. You're just a partisan. You like the idea of OAN and Newsmax and Fox News going away. I think the fact that so many different platforms have come under discussion for the same sort of treatment should show you that this does not stay limited to the right side of the spectrum. Now, I would have a little more respect for these lawmakers if they threw, MSNBC and Rachel Maddow in the mix for their outrageous conspiracy mongering. We covered here how Jonathan Chait is still hanging on to the idea that Trump has been a Russian asset since 1987. What about that hotbed of misinformation? How about the Hillary Clinton podcast where she was wondering whether Trump was on the phone with Vladimir Putin during the riots? How about that hotbed of misinformation? So it's a purely partisan game. And here's the other piece. Again, even if you don't care about the principle, which I think the principle is the most important thing, and I think you have to apply that principle, whether it's good for your team or whether it's not good for your team. But let's say you don't care, okay? Here, this censorship, it doesn't work. And in fact, it can obscure and push to the corners where it's harder to monitor exactly the sorts of things that you're most afraid of. When I talked to Ken Klippenstein in the wake of Parler getting taken down, he said, actually, it's very hard now for our intelligence agencies to monitor the chatter of people who are potential extremists, because now they're scattered to all different corners of the internet. They're not all sort of like congregated in one place where they're easily monitored, or their accounts have been taken down on Twitter, so you can't see what they're saying and what they're planning, what they're thinking about there. Here's the other thing. Let's say you do take Newsmax and OAN and Fox News off the air. Like, do you think conservatives are just going to stop consuming media? Right. No, they're more likely to go even more extreme places.
I was going to say, honestly, it would be worse, and they would listen to much crazier people who don't have editorial standards and who won't get sued by Dominion.
Exactly right.
Well, this is the problem, and we see it so clearly now, which is that as censorship begins to move up, like these units of the stack, is we're like, wait a second, because each one actually represents an exponential more threat to our freedom. Because at the company level, yeah, like Twitter, okay, like, will somebody survive if they're off Twitter? Yes, they're going to be fine. But if you basically get taken down by Amazon Web Services, you can't host a website anymore. We're talking an entire order of magnitude, something different.
Yeah.
Then, if you start having Comcast and AT&T and Time Warner pick what can and cannot be in the cable bundle, oh my God. I mean, there basically have gone to a place we have never been before in American history. And then from there to the ISP level, which again is coming, as they've already come after Signal, then we are entering a new age where you actually, like every American who's on the internet, which is what, 90-something% of our populace, cannot access a website. You just basically made something from a few million users on Twitter to the entire country. And it's happening with light speed.
Yeah, and that's where also the fact that these companies are gigantic monopolies.
This is where it becomes
really because you only need like a decision by 3 people in order for you to be essentially banned from the internet. And that's exactly what happened with Parler.
It's very worrying. All right, I'm looking forward to your radar next, Crystal.